Routing and Remote Access, Part 3. In this nugget, we continue our discussion of routing and remote access, and this is Part 3 where we start off a discussion of RAP, not rap music, but remote access policy. This can be quite complicated and baffling because very often it looks like it's going to connect you when it doesn't, or vice versa. So we'll take a look at how that gains access for remote access, or how it denies access, and conversely. We'll also take a look at the policy processing. Well, there's kind of an involved logic tree in that, and I'll put up on nuggetlab.com a graphic that'll help you to understand that. Then we'll look at RRAS, which is how we're going to centralize the authentication that takes place with remote access servers. We'll centralize that on a single or fewer RRAS servers than we have of RRAS servers. Then we'll take a look at how to configure it, first of all, as well as the authentication, which I just discussed, and we can also look at the accounting of it. Part of the accounting for me is to also look at the event logs and to see if everything syncs up properly. Then we also look at RRAS and IAS servers. This is a security group that's on your domain controller that your RRAS server must be a member of in order to look at properties of user accounts. Well, let me tell you about remote access policies. I'll tell you, they can be really tough to figure out. And it's really because there's a strange logic tree that you have to think through in order to make them work. For example, let's go ahead and take a look at a network connection that I've got configured here. It's just a plain connection, a PPTP connection to DC Nugget 1. There's not really that much to it if we go to its properties. It's got just default settings all here, just an IP address, default options. Security is just going to use a password, so it's not going to be using IPsec or anything. So it's just going to make it a PPTP connection when it connects automatically here. That's really all there is to it. So if I want to connect with this, I'll just need to enter in the password and click on connect, right? Well, maybe you're practicing with this and you say, you know what, I want to check out those remote access policies in routing and remote access. So you go down here to the server and you go down here to routing and remote access policies and you go to the connections to Microsoft Routing and Remote Access server. That looks like about the one we want. So we'll double click on that and you say, I wonder if I can block everybody from being able to connect. I'll bet I can. Click on deny remote access permission. Okay, good. So now we're going to deny, so that means that when I try to click connect here, it's going to try to negotiate, and then it's going to drop me. Probably just any moment now, it's going to disconnect and reject my connection attempt. Or not. It says I'm now connected? How can that be? Wait a minute. Yeah, I've got a PPTP connection. I'm connected all right. How did that happen? Well, that's what happens with remote access policies when you have to consider several other things that are involved with them. I'll tell you, trying to figure out remote access policies and whether or not someone can connect to a remote access server is a lot like trying to figure out the tax code. It's pretty complicated at times. But I've put something together here that I think will help to make it simpler for you. You see, the reason why we were able to connect, even though the policy said to deny access, was if I go to Active Directory users and computers and go to the user account, go down here to, I was connecting as trainer, so if I go to the trainer user account and then go over to the dial-in tab, we see that I have allow access configured right here. Now, how would I actually allow this to then deny me access? I would choose this option, control access, through the remote access policy. However, having chosen that, there's still ways that I could get in. Also, with allow access, and with that original setting I had on the policy to deny access, there are other settings that would still deny me, even though I chose allow here, and even though it says deny on the policy. So there's really a conundrum of different ways of looking at this, and I'll try to make this as simple as I can. First of all, let's just, for our own satisfaction, go to control access through a remote access policy here, and get my OK button back. And then I'm going to make that same connection again. And this time we're going to see that when we try to connect now, that it's going to kick me out. And that's exactly what we see here. We'll try to redial, of course, but I'll just go ahead and close it. And it says I don't have permission to dial in, which is kind of a general statement. But the reality of why I couldn't dial in is because I'm controlling access through remote access policy, and I'm denying remote access permission in this policy. So what that's saying is pay attention to what these two things say if you are controlling access through remote access policy. Now, let's get into a little bit more detail about what this whole policy is, what all these different components are. And the first thing we start off with is a policy condition. And notice that the tab of this one, or the title bar of this one, is connection to Microsoft Routing and Remote Access servers. And if we double click on this and look at the properties, it just gives us these strange characters, caret, 311, $sign. This is just the Microsoft code for a Microsoft RRAS server. So it's pretty open. As long as you're connecting to a Microsoft RRAS server, you should have no problem either denying or granting the connection. Now, here's the way this works. First of all, when I make the connection, then if I'm controlling access through remote access policy, it looks at the conditions, and if I can match this condition, in other words, I am connecting to a Microsoft routing and remote access server, then the flag goes on of true, and I'm connecting to and matching this policy condition. Then what happens? Well, if I'm matching the connection request, if I'm matching that condition up here at the top, what happens? Deny or grant. If I choose grant and try the connection again now, then we're going to see that I connect quite successfully, no problem whatsoever. And click on connect, registering a computer, and we can tell already that it's going to go ahead and connect me. And there I am, I'm now connected. Let me get out of that real quick. So again, because I was controlling access through remote access policy, and this time granting permission, we were able to go ahead and get in. By the way, by default, this policy, as well as the other one in the background that we can't see right now, but you probably saw it earlier, will both deny remote access permission. The other one's just for any vendor besides Microsoft. And also, if you do go to Microsoft, Active Directory users and computers, and you go to a user account, on that dial-in tab, if you're in Windows 2000 mixed domain functional level, then the default setting for any user account that's created is always deny access. Once you've gone up to the Windows Server 2003 domain functional level or the Windows 2000 native domain functional level, which do not consider the presence of NT4 domain controllers at all, because hopefully they're all gone by then, then by default any new accounts will go to control access through remote access policy. Either way, with all default settings, nobody's getting in with dial-in permissions. Because when you're controlling it through remote access policy, as we see here, remember that your actual policy in routing and remote access is to deny remote access permissions. Now, one of the things that's the most useful in this dialog box here for policy conditions is when you click on Add, because you get a whole bunch of different items that you can choose from here, what kind of a connection it is, whether or not you're connecting to an IIS server or a RADIUS server in Microsoft's case. You'll also see network access server, which is another way of saying a RAS server. That's just kind of a generic way of saying it. So we see several different things here, but probably the most useful are the day and time restrictions, so that you can select items in here where you want people to be allowed to connect or not. Maybe you don't want anybody working over the weekend, so you're going to go ahead and select these items and deny access there. Maybe you don't want anybody to work during certain other hours during the day, so you can just permit or deny certain hours here. And then if somebody calls in at this time on Sunday, whatever that is, morning, I guess, early Sunday morning, then they're going to be denied a connection attempt if I clicked OK here, because we would then have a match item there for what time of day it is. And the other very useful policy condition among all of these is this next one, which is Windows Groups. And for this, you can select a global group. Now, listen to that again. A global group. Not a domain local, not a universal, but only a global group. So you click on Add here, and then you can specify some group. For example, maybe we have configured dial-up for only domain admins, or only for administrators of some kind. So I'll just choose domain admins, and click OK here. And it didn't take. Oh, I got to go to the locations. I got to go to the domain here. So go to nuggetlab.com, and my location's over there. Now this should take. There we go. Had myself scared for a moment there. All right, then we'll click OK here, and now we'll see that yes, we can connect if we're connecting to a Microsoft RAS server, and of course we are, because that's what we're on. And if we're a member of domain admins, then we will be denied the connection at this point. If I want to change that, I'll just click Grant, and that would prevent anybody from connecting unless you're a member of domain admins now. So let's go ahead and test that out to see if that's really going to work. So I'm going to go connect to DC Nugget 1, and then I'm going to go ahead and make my connection. So I'll click on Connect here, and it's registering my computer. Looks like it's going to go ahead and take, so that'll be just fine. I'm actually going to disconnect immediately as soon as it connects, because we want to see also what would happen if we tried to make a connection as some other user that was not a domain admin. So having flipped back over here to Active Directory users and computers, let's just go to my smart user account. We have used a smart card to log this person in the past. We don't have to. We can also just log in with our conventional method using a password here. If I go to dial-in, yep, they're connecting through a remote access policy, controlled through a remote access policy. So the next thing I'll do now then is I'm going to make that same connection, but this time I'm going to enter in credentials of that user instead. So I'll enter those in and go ahead and make my connection, and this time we're going to see that it connected me. Well, now here you see we get into another one of those conundrums with remote access policies. And then I just went ahead and disconnected that. Now, here's what should have happened. It really should have not connected that user. The reason why it did is because when you make changes to these policies, don't work too fast through this. Don't just click OK and then immediately make your next connection, because it takes a little while. It takes a few seconds for this to wake up on the system or something. Frankly, I really don't know what cycle it has to go through or what refresh it has to go through before this actually is enacted. But if you do try to make your next connection immediately, you're likely to get skewed results because it's not going to do what you expect. So now I've waited a few seconds because I was blathering on there. So now we'll go ahead and connect to DC Nugget 1 again here, and then I'll connect now, and sure enough, we don't have permission to dial in because of the way that policy was. So I'm taking you through all of this because I've learned a lot of tips. I've been working with this for years, since Windows 2000. It's mostly the same as Windows 2000's policies. And this thing can drive you in circles and have you chasing your tail, thinking that you're chasing down a problem that you really don't have. So just be careful of some of these things as I go along and as I tell you about them. Now, let's take a look at another scenario. What if in Active Directory users and computers, I've got a group called dial-up users. It's a global security group, and I've added my smart user to the dial-up users, and I want them to be able to dial into this, and I actually have added them to that dial-up users account, or to that group. Well, what I would do now is create another policy. You see, I could go to this existing policy, and where it says domain admins here, I could just add in another group into this. But what that would wind up doing would mean that I have to be both a member of domain admins and a member of the dial-up users group in order to connect. Well, that would then kick out all of my existing domain admins, and all of my dial-up user groups would not be able to dial up either because they're not also domain admins. So eventually that would mean that nobody connects. So I'm not going to manipulate this existing policy to try to fiddle with that. Instead, what I'm going to do is to create another policy here, and I'm going to go right-click, choose New Remote Access Policy, and the wizard will take you through several scenarios that are kind of pre-packaged for common scenarios if you want, or you can do a custom one. We'll just do a pre-packaged one, and I'll call this one Dial-Up User Access, and click on Next. I'll say that I want to make this a VPN connection as well, and then I'll add my group membership in here. And of course, I got to remember this time to click on Location so this thing doesn't make a fool of me. I do a fine job of that on my own, so I'll click OK here now and choose Dial Up. And there's my Dial-Up Users Security Group, and Next. And then I'll just use Chat version 2 should be fine. Click on Next, and I'm going to continue to use here as well encryption for my data. So I'm going to go ahead and do and click on Next and Finish. Now once I've done that, notice that it puts it at the top of the order automatically over here. Let's expand this out so you can see it. Puts it at the top of the order. So if I go ahead and connect now, what's going to happen? It's going to go ahead and let me go over here to connect again, and we'll have the smart user there. I just went ahead and saved the password. If you're on a secure system where you know no one else can access it, you can do that. Now we're registering on the network. Looks like it's going to connect just fine. It's not kicking me out. Everything will work. And indeed, here's the connection down here. If I click on it, we see that we do have a connection going on. I'll just go ahead and disconnect. Now then, this kind of also begs a question. I mean, what if I am a domain admin? I'm the trainer account who's a domain admin, and I'm trying to dial in. Well, the first thing that it's going to read is this policy, and I don't match the conditions of this policy because I'm not a dial-up user. So, since I'm not a dial-up user, what's it going to do? Is it going to kick me out? Well, actually, in a way, yes. This policy will not process for you. However, what happens is, it says, oh, well, that one didn't work, let me try the next one. And we'll see if that one works. It'll just keep going through all of these until it finds one that'll work. So let's go ahead and give that a try just to confirm that. We'll go to DC Nugget 1, where we'll connect this time as the trainer account. Click to connect that. We're registering on the network, and we're going to make the connection just fine. And so we'll go ahead and disconnect this. Now, the thing that goes on here is, again, it reads the first one. If that one doesn't work or if it doesn't match anything within that, it'll just move on to the second one and further on down the list until it finds one that has the appropriate conditions. Now, when I say that it goes from one policy to the next to find whichever one allows it access, that's a little bit overstated. Let's go ahead and take a look at another scenario here as well. Really what it's doing is it's just looking to see if it matches policy conditions, yes or no. If it doesn't match any of these policy conditions, then it'll just move on. Because since it doesn't match anything, it doesn't know whether to grant or deny any access. So then it'll move on to the next policy. On the next one, it sees if it can match any policy conditions there. And if it does, then it will correspondingly grant or deny connection here because it can see so right down here. So let's test that out. For this one, I've gone to the dial-up users. Instead of using the dial-up users, now I'm going to domain users, and I'm just denying access permission. Now, I am a domain admin, and as a result, my trainer user account is also a member of domain users. So, when I hit this domain users remote access condition here, it says deny remote access, it's going to stop me cold right there. It's not going to move on down and read the next one, and then because I'm a domain admin and I'm a member of this group, grant me permission here. It won't even read this policy because it'll be stopped cold at the first level. So let's go ahead and click on that and click on Connect to DC Nugget 1, where again I'm the trainer. Now when I try to connect, bam, stopped cold because of that first policy, never even got to this policy. Well, that's no good, because now I got a bunch of domain admins that are boo-hooing me and saying, hey, what'd you do to our blasted policies? Nobody can dial in, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, fine then. I'll just right-click here, choose Move Up. See, now it's going to read this one first. So if you're a domain admin, you're going to match this condition for domain admins. I'll grant you permission. Have a nice day. And then you're going to connect. However, if you're a member of domain users or dial-up users, and you go to this next policy, because you didn't match this one, so since you didn't match it, you just go ahead and look at the next one and see if you can match any conditions within that one. This one they are going to match because they're domain users, and they're just going to go deny remote access permission. This means that then, since I'm reading this one and I'm going to match a condition, I'm going to go ahead and connect to it as a trainer account, and if I click on Connect here, we see that indeed it's going to register me and connect me just fine. And I'll go ahead and disconnect this one as well. Now, what the moral of the story here is this. Really plan these things out carefully and be very careful of the order, because just flipping two of these around can just stop you cold and really cause a problem. And on the other hand, it's not always a problem. It's also a good strategy. I mean, I can really arrange these in a smart fashion so that I can make sure that the people I want in are getting in and the people I don't want in are not getting in. Let's go ahead and test that out again. This time I'm going to connect again as my smart user account. Now remember, since I'm not a domain admin, it's going to read these conditions in that first policy, say, well, I don't match any of that, so I don't know what to do. So I'll click on the next one, or go down to the next one, and see if I can match any of those policy conditions. This time it's going to do that. It's going to match the condition because it's a domain user account, and then it's going to kick me out. So I'll enter in the smart user credentials here, click connect, and what do you know, sure enough, it's kicking me out now. Well, how confused are you now? I know when I first started doing this, it was driving me insane, and I would just go for hours trying to figure out different scenarios for ordering these policies and denying access here, allowing access there, controlling access through user accounts, remote access policies, and the like. So what I've done here for you is I've looked at some Microsoft documentation as well as some of my own experiences and the testing that I've come up with, and I've gone ahead and created a flowchart here, which I think will help you to figure this out. And if you just believe the flowchart that I've created for you, and I'm going to put this JPEG file up on nuggetlab.com for you, then you're going to be okay. First of all, here we have a connection attempt that we're trying, and the first thing that it asks is, are there policies present? Because look at this. If I go into this remote access policies, I might just get frustrated. I might just say, you know what, this is just stupid. None of this stuff works. I don't even know why we even use any of these things. I'm just going to delete all of these, and that way I'll make sure that there's no rules in play that are going to prevent people from dialing in. So I'm going to connect now, and I'm going to dial in, and bam, I'm not going to dial in, am I? You see, if there are no policies to process, it can't grant you access. There's no radio button anywhere that says grant access if you match various policy conditions. So now that I deleted all of those, guess what? I got to recreate them from scratch. Okay, so that's my own problem. Anyway, we go into this. If there are no policies present, it's just going to kick you out. Reject the connection attempt. If there are policies present, then we move on to the next decision point, and the connection here is connection attempt match the conditions. Remember the time of day or group membership or whether or not it's a VPN connection. If I don't match the connection attempt conditions, then it's just going to process the next policy and start me over again through this loop. If I do match some of the conditions, then we get into whether or not it's going to grant access to that user account. So the next thing that's decided then is on the user account. Does that user account say deny access? If it does not say deny access, then it's going to go ahead and move through the rest of the policing. If it does say deny access, then we're going to reject that connection attempt, and none of the rest of this stuff over here at this point will matter at all. We're just going to disregard all the rest of it. However, if it does not say deny access, what are the other two possibilities? Well, one of the radio buttons was allow access, and the other radio button was control access through remote access policy. Well, if we had chosen allow access, and if that's what the choice was there, and the answer to that was yes, then we would continue on down and process remainders of the policy. If we had not chosen on the user account allow access, which by implication means we've instead chosen control access through remote access policy, then we have to see if the setting there is to deny access if we are controlling access through the remote access policy. So we match the conditions of the policy, and once we match the conditions, are we going to be denied access? If we are, then we just reject the connection attempt, and that's pretty much it. If the answer is no, which by implication means we are controlling access through remote access policy, we match the conditions, and the radio button says grant access, then what's going to happen is it's going to go down here, and it's going to come to a final decision point and decide if the user and the profile settings within that remote access policy match. Now, the user settings that they're talking about there is like if I go into the user account here for the smart card user and I go over to the dial-up item here, there's not a whole lot here, but for example, if we have a callback number, which means that as soon as the user makes the connection to the server, maybe they're using a modem, then the server, the RRAS server, will dial back using its modem to a specific phone number. That's a security measure so that I can make sure that I'm always calling back to the same location and I'm not calling some hacker out in Bangladesh somewhere. So that's one of the kinds of properties that you can match there for that, for the user account. And then the profile match we haven't actually covered quite yet. I'm going to reconstruct some policies there and show you what some of the profile settings are. But those also can be things like time of day. It'll also tell you when the user disconnects, how long they can stay connected, and probably dozens, if not a couple of hundred, additional settings, which we'll address in a little while here. In any case, if they then match all the conditions for the user account, of which I don't have any configured, and if they also match any of the profile settings, then the next thing that happens is they're going to have a successful connection. If they don't match some of those things, any of those things, then the connection is going to be rejected. Like I said, just look at the chart, go through it, test it on your own. I strongly recommend that you create your own connections. You don't have to have a whole lab full of servers and clients to be able to do this. You can connect to yourself using your own server, and for most things you need to do, especially when it comes to testing this whole process out, this whole little logic tree out, you can use VPN connections to yourself to test all of this stuff out. Now then, in a fit of rage, I deleted all of these policies because they were causing me so many problems, right? Well, now I've got to recreate something. So how am I going to recreate them? Especially if I want to get back the default policies that were already there when I first configured this so that I could kind of have a ground zero from which to start. Well, to do that, go to Help and Support Center, and there are instructions in Help and Support Center. I'll tell you what to type in here. Put in quotation marks these words. Quotation mark, recreate the default remote access policy. Recreate the default remote access policy. The first part of that is hyphenated. Okay, so then search against that, and then in the search results, it will give you this topic, recreate default remote access policy. Gives you all the instructions on how to do that right through here. Basically, you just recreate them with only a couple of modifications from scratch, and you're going to be back in business. And I'm going to go ahead and recreate those for us offline so that we have something to work with. Now here I've recreated these, and I want to point out, well, actually there's several more things I want to point out, but one of the things I want to point out is, again, another thing that's especially confusing to people as they first warm up to these remote access policies. Let's say I want to allow people to dial in 24/7, so I'll go into this policy, and I'll click another policy condition, I'll click on Add, and I'll say Day and Time Restrictions, Add, and right now it says everyone's denied. Well, we don't want that. We want people to be able to dial in 24/7, so I'll click on Permitted and click OK and click OK. Now it looks like I'll be able to dial in pretty much anytime I want, so I'll click on my connection here and try to connect, and I'm denied. Well, how can that be? I just allowed everyone access by 24/7 access. No, actually what I did was I created a condition that says anytime during a 24-hour period, 24/7, deny access. Let's go take a look at that. If I go back into this, this is my condition. All I want to see is if you're trying to connect 24/7, if you're trying to connect during any time of the day, any time of the week, then what am I going to do? Deny remote access permission. So keep that kind of a thing in mind as well as you do these, and I'm going to remove that one for the time being so we don't muddy that policy up. Now let's go ahead and take a look at another thing as well. We've already made it through, let's say we're making a dial-up connection, and we have the user account property configured to allow access or control access through remote access policy. We passed our conditions, so we've gone up here. We are connecting to a Microsoft server. We passed that. We're granted permission right down here. We pass through that. Next thing that happens then is, and you'll see this on our little flowchart as well, is it goes to see whether or not we can match the user and the profile. Now, we're not regarding the user right now. If we can see if we can edit the profile and match the profile settings. Now, we will be subject to anything that we configure within this. So, for example, administrator decides we don't want people to fall asleep at the keyboard and remain connected indefinitely. So, if they're idle for 10 minutes, then we're going to automatically disconnect them, especially if they're using a phone line at the hotel that charges $1 a minute. Well, we don't want them to fall asleep at the keyboard and ring up a bunch of charges. So then we'll also connect them for a certain number of time, and we'll also, maybe we got a limited phone bank. We only have so many connections available. We're getting a lot of busy signals. Well, I got some people that are trying to surf the internet all night long through the dial-up connection, through free internet access here at work. So I'm going to say, you know what, if you're connected 60 minutes, that's enough time to check your email. After that, we're going to disconnect you. And you see that we can also allow access, again, only during certain days and times and so forth. We can also allow access only to a certain number. So the number that the user dials into, especially if it's a modem connection, will allow them to connect to that certain number. Also, a network access point, network access server port type. Maybe we only want to allow access on 802.11 wireless connections, or we only want to allow Ethernet connections or VPN connections, all different kinds of things like you see down through here, VPN connections, there it is, that kind of stuff. So I can make people subject to any of these kinds of things as well. Then there's the IP filters that we configured here as well that I talked to you about earlier. You can identify these items. And these pretty well explain themselves. If the default setting here, server settings determine IP address assignment. Remember in routing remote access early on here, I right-clicked on the server, chose properties. That's where you determine whether or not you're going to use a static pool or DHCP. Well, that's what that's talking about here if we use the server settings there. And then if I go to the multi-link item, this is where I'm going to be able to configure how many modems will be able to be connected at one time. And we saw that the server did allow multi-link connections again early on in this whole series when we were looking at that item. But you can also specify this manually and allow multi-link connections only to a maximum number of ports if you want. And that way, if you've got users with 4 modems trying to dial in, you can limit their connection so they don't hog all the connections. Although with broadband and DSL being less expensive than it has been in the past, this is probably not going to be as much of an issue as it used to be. This is kind of handy. This bandwidth allocation protocol thing can really control the capacity for your phone lines. For example, and again, I'm thinking now of mostly modem kind of access or ISDN access. For the percentage of the capacity, if it falls below 50% for 2 minutes, then I can drop a connection. And that way I can free up a line that it doesn't look like anybody actually needs to use for that time. And then on the Advanced tab here, this addresses a lot of pretty obscure things that you'll probably really never have to deal with. But if you click on Add, you see there's got to be hundreds of different kinds of things you can work with. A lot of these are vendor specific. So if you have a very specific kind of modem with a very specific part of the world where they use certain kinds of control codes when they establish modem connections and all this kind of stuff, or if you're using IPX over US robotics modem, all that kind of stuff, then you might need to make some selections there. Most of that, like I said, that was very obscure. And then on the encryption here, there's no encryption selected here, or actually deselected, so you have to use some form of encryption. Now, here we have basic, strong, and strongest encryption for Microsoft point-to-point encryption, which is what you're going to be using if you're going to use normal dial-up connections like with a modem, or if you're going to be using VPN connections and PPTP connections. If you're using L2TP and IPsec, then you're not going to be using MPP E40-bit encryption. Instead, you're going to be using, and you kind of put in your mind, in parentheses out here to the side for L2TP and IPsec, 56-bit data encryption standard. Sometimes I'll also say digital encryption standard, but really it's data encryption standard. So, 56-bit data encryption standard for L2TP and IPsec. Now, going on down to the strong setting here, if you're going to use L2TP and IPsec VPN connections, then you're still going to continue to use 56-bit DES encryption. If you go down to, however, the strongest setting, instead of using MPP E128-bit for L2TP IPsec VPN connections, you're going to be using 168-bit triple DES encryption for that strongest setting. So just make sure that you know the equivalents. And really, it's pretty easy. For these top two, 56-bit DES, the bottom one, triple DES, which is 168-bit encryption. And then on the Authentication tab, remember for your EAP methods here that if you're going to use a smart card, click on Add, choose your smart card or other certificate, click OK, and then there's your smart card or other certificate, and make sure that you have the appropriate certificate that you need listed here as well. Recall from early in our discussion of routing remote access that I talked about the remote authentication dial-in user service, or RADIUS service. Some people also call it remote access dial-in user service. Whoever you're talking to, it's the same thing. Microsoft's implementation of it is the Internet Authentication Service, where we will collect credentials from various RAS servers throughout our organization, consolidate that all onto a single IAS or RADIUS server, and then forward those credentials onto a domain controller, which then sends the yes or no answer to the credential checking back to the RADIUS server, and then passes it back to the RAS servers. Now, that seems like a lot of back and forth, but overall, it's really a lot less administration for the administrator, because we're going to be able to use just one RADIUS server or just a few RADIUS servers so that we can use that to check all of the logs for successful and unsuccessful connection attempts and to consolidate all of our credential checking. So in a large or dispersed organization, or maybe if you're an ISP that's got all kinds of RAS servers that you have to check out, well, instead of checking out each individual one of them for all of the logs respectively, you can consolidate it all here. And on DC Nugget 4, where I am right now, you see that I've already gone to Add Remove Programs to go to the Windows Components wizard to add remove Windows Components. And to install RADIUS, or IAS, you'll go to the Networking Services, and from here you'll just select Internet Authentication Service and click OK. And then we'll just next and wait for the wizard to finish itself, or the Windows Components wizard to finish itself. And then once that's finished, of course, we'll just click on Finish and close this out. And then we'll go to the Start menu to Administrative Tools. And then instead of going to Routing and Remote Access, we're going to go up here instead to Internet Authentication Service. Now we need to make sure that our RAS servers are aware of this IAS server, and we need to make sure that the IAS server is also aware of our RADIUS clients. Now the RADIUS clients are the RRAS servers. Don't think of a RADIUS client as the guy on the laptop who's dialing in from the hotel room. The RADIUS clients are RRAS servers that are forwarding on the credentials and consolidating logging, perhaps, also to this RADIUS server. Now then, once we've gone ahead and got IAS configured over here, we need to configure who the RADIUS clients are. In other words, which RRAS servers are going to forward their requests and or their accounting over to this RADIUS server. What our logging is going to be, whether we're going to use a local file or a SQL server. For our purposes, we'll just stick with a local file. SQL server will also include a lot of other information, such as a special user account used to access that file and other things relative to SQL. And then we'll go to remote access policies as well. By the way, do these look familiar at all? They're exactly the same policies that we already have on routing and remote access services by default. And now the burden for policy processing is going to be shifted over to the RADIUS server for any of its RADIUS clients. Then you can also do connection request processing, which is a little bit beyond our scope, but basically the idea here is you can configure RADIUS server groups. These would be what we call RADIUS proxies. What this relates to is whether or not I'm going to authenticate RAS clients locally here on this RADIUS server, or whether I'm going to pass them off in yet another handoff to another RADIUS server or group of RADIUS servers. And then the connection request policies determine the criteria for when and how to do that. For our purposes, let's just go ahead and configure a RADIUS client. I'll just right-click here, choose New RADIUS Client, and give it the friendly name, DC Nugget 1 in my case, DC Nugget 1. And then you can also verify the client IP or address here as well. So I'll click on Verify and enter in DC Nugget 1 and resolve that if I want to see. I've got two IP addresses on that, so we're doing okay with that. Okay, so I got 10.10.10.20 correlating to DC Nugget 1. That's fine. Go ahead and click on Next. Then I specify who the client vendor is. You see, we're just going to use the RADIUS standard because we're in an all Microsoft situation here, and Microsoft does use the RADIUS standard. By the way, there's not really a configured standard that's a standard out there on the internet, like there's not a RFC for it. But the Internet Engineering Task Force does have papers on RADIUS, which are kind of generally accepted, and that's what Microsoft uses. Then you can also choose other vendors. If you're working with other vendors for RAS connections and so forth, you would enter in their configuration here. And then I'll enter in a shared secret here. This will just be something like a password that I'll have on this RADIUS server, and I'll share that same secret on the RADIUS clients. And I'll just enter in a password. And then you can also include a message authenticator to make sure that this message is coming from who it says it's coming from. And then we'll just go ahead and finish that. We now have DC Nugget 1 as a RADIUS client to this RADIUS server. Now let's go ahead and check out our logging. Really not that much to do here for the local file. I can specify what I want it to log. All of this stuff is going to be logged anyway in the event log, but I can also log it in text in a text file for the log file here. So let's go ahead and do these things. You could also do periodic status for the log file, but it really fills up the log file fast because it's very verbose. And then the log file itself, you see it's going to be stored in the following directory, and we could put that elsewhere. And especially if you're running a very busy RAS server, you probably want to put that on a different spindle or on a different RAID array of some kind. And then you specify the other information here, which is self-explanatory. Then, of course, you could do a SQL server as well, and then your policies. Again, these are exactly the same policies that we had before, so that means that when I double-click on this, remember what they are by default? They deny remote access permission. So we're not going to be able to get a connection with this one initially. And let's just confirm that when we go to the other side and configure our RAS server over here. Now, the next thing I need to do then is to go to this RAS server on DC Nugget 1, which is now the Radius client as soon as I'm done configuring this. And I'm going to go to the Properties. Then I'm going to go back over here to the Security tab and choose Windows, or rather Radius Authentication, and configure DC Nugget 4, where I'd already configured it at an earlier point in time to save us a little bit of time here. And this is the information that I mentioned in a previous nugget. So just the name of the server, the name of the same shared secret that I had before, the timeout in seconds, so that if I have multiple Radius servers that I can use, then if it doesn't get to the first one after 5 seconds, it moves on to the second one. And there's an initial score, which allows us to determine a priority. And remember, this is a self-adjusting score based upon network responsiveness, and then, of course, the port over which the Radius accounting and or authentication is going to take place. 1812 is for our authentication, and then, of course, again, we're using the message authenticator here. And then for this Radius provider down here, Radius accounting, do the same exact thing. Really, there's not that much different except for the fact that we use a different port down here. And we also send Radius accounting on and off messages for whenever this local RAS server starts or stops its service, then it'll also notify my Radius server of that fact. So now this Radius client's pretty well configured. We'll just click OK here. Notice that it tells us we do have to restart RRAS for both the accounting and for the authentication. Notice my my policies node down here just disappeared because I'm not going to use policies, remote access policies, on this server anymore. And then I'm going to go ahead and, whoops, if I can get my mouse pointer to work right, there we go. We're going to restart this server, at which point we'll be ready to use the Radius server. Now let me also be clear again, the reason why we don't have policies in remote access now is because all those now are going to be processed on the IAS server, which is also a great way to consolidate policies for multiple RAS servers on a single IAS server. And you can even configure different policies for different RAS servers if you have different requirements for each one. Now I'm going to go ahead and make a connection attempt to DC Nugget 1 from this shortcut to DC Nugget 1's remote access connection. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this, and I'm going to go ahead and click Connect. Before I do that, I'm also going to start Network Monitor just to see if we see anything of interest here. So I'm going to go ahead now and connect, and then we're, of course, denied because of the policy that was on the Radius server. But we do see that we did have Radius traffic going on, and if we double-click on this, we'll see that we had, of course, our destination port of 1812, UDP port 1812, because that was for our authentication port, and then we saw some authenticator information in this. Remember, we requested an authenticator in the checkbox for both the client and the server. And then I'm skipping down here a little bit. We see the tunnel type. It was attempting to establish a PPTP connection. And who is the user? I should say that somewhere down here who the user was. Username, there we go. Username was Smart User. That was the user account that I was attempting to use. And we see that it was also rejected down in this frame, again using port 1812. And we see that, again, it just rejected that connection attempt, which you can see right here. Right, well now let's go back over to DC Nugget 4. We're going to change the characteristics of this remote access policy to grant remote access permission now. And now just about immediately, I'll probably have to wait just a couple of seconds here, now it's going to allow that connection attempt that we had tried to make earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and again capture traffic here, connect. This time it's registering the computer on the network, and we're going to see a successful connection attempt because I changed the policy on the Radius server. And then in here we see some pertinent traffic to this Radius again. We had an access request. Once again, port 1812 was going on. And the rest of this actually is the same information that we saw in the previous one, except that this time we have an access accept instead of a denial. Now then, let's also go to that Radius server on DC Nugget 4 over here. And we're going to go ahead and take a look at the log file that it created from this connection attempt. So we'll go click on C:\Windows System 32 log files. That brings this open here, and we'll double click to crack open the log file. And we saw that we made a connection attempt here from 10.10.10.20 using the smart user account. And there's a lot of information here that's indecipherable because part of this has to do with the authenticator. You'll see some indecipherable numbers along the middle here that don't make any sense to us mere mortals. Tell us who the user is, tell us what the connection was, whether it made a connection to the routing and remote access server and so forth. So that's all comma delimited information as well, so that you can put it into a spreadsheet and further manipulate that information. Other things that might be of interest is that in the computer management, you should also see a record of the Internet Authentication Service connection attempts. So if I go into the event viewer in the system event log, I go to this warning, I see that the smart user was denied access, and this I kind of like, even better than looking at that text file, because it gives me some more information that humans can read, a little bit easier format here. It tells me what port it was coming from, or rather what IP address it was coming from, and so forth. I'm trying to use Windows authentication, which is basically telling me that the RRAS server used Windows authentication to the Active Directory to authenticate this client. And it tells me that the connection attempt failed because the user account was denied. Again, that's just a little bit too general. It's really not because the account was denied as a matter of credentials or something like that, as much as it was because the remote access policy denied access. And it does say that as well in that same text there. Now, if we go up one step here, we see that now the smart user was granted access. And what I also like to do with this, by the way, is I like to just make sure that all of my accounting is in order and I've got everything synchronized well between the RRAS server and the RRAS client. I look at the time that this was made, and then I compare that to my domain controllers, and I compare that to my remote access server and see if all that's in sync, because I want to see if someone's actually forwarding on connection attempt requests as a bogus attempt to reuse credentials or something like that, and that's what I'm looking for there. So now I'll switch over here to DC Nugget 2, my domain controller, and I see that at 8:51:53, the exact same second, I did have an account log on that took place using the Microsoft Authentication package, and it was, again, for the smart user account, so that correlates well, and I can kind of track the authentication process through these servers. Now, do keep in mind that in order for my RRAS server here, DC Nugget 4, in order for this RRAS server to be able to authenticate on behalf of its RRAS clients, it also has to be a member of the same domain as these RRAS clients, or in the same forest as these RRAS clients. And that's what gives it the ability to work with Active Directory. Now, here's something else we need to look at as well that we have not quite done here yet. We've basically just been working off credential checking back and forth to our Active Directory domain controller. But if we need to access more specific details about the user account, maybe if there's a callback number or something like that, then I need to right-click on this Internet Authentication Service item and register this server in Active Directory, and that's going to give it the ability to do what it says, just right here, to read the user's dial-in properties from the domain. Then you just click OK, and now it'll be authorized to read those dial-in properties. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at DC Nugget 2 again here as well, and take a look at a specific group membership in Active Directory users and computers. You see, if I need to make my RRAS server capable of reading user accounts and other domains, remember I mentioned earlier that it has to be in the same domain or in the same forest. Well, if it has to read something out of a different domain, then I need to make sure that the RRAS server is a member of a specific group. And that's down here in the users node, and if I scroll down, I think I can find it here, RAS and IAS servers. So if this was in a different domain than the membership of that actual RRAS server, I would have to just manually add it into the group membership here as a computer account, and then it would be good to go in that other domain. Of course, here we're in the same domain that we actually are working within, and that's member server of, so I don't have to add it in manually because it's already done automatically. In this nugget, we discussed part 3 of routing and remote access with the discussion of remote access policy. And in this discussion, we talked about how to gain access, or actually conversely, to deny access. And sometimes it's kind of baffling because it looks like you're supposed to gain access when you don't, or you don't gain access when you think you're supposed to. So a big part of that is understanding the remote access policy processing. And then we moved on into RRAS, where we can centralize both the accounting and the authentication of our remote access servers to a single location. We looked at how to configure configure that, as well as the authentication and accounting properties. Then we have to remember that we also have to put the RRAS server in the remote access and IAS servers. So it's the RRAS and IAS servers security group that allows us to peek into properties of the user's account. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.